Tonight, we're covering the rise and fall of one of the most powerful symbols of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall. Built overnight and standing for nearly 3 decades, it divided not just the city, but families, ideologies, and the hopes of millions. This is the story of how Berlin became a frontline in a global struggle, how walls were built not just of concrete but of fear, and how, against all odds, they were brought down. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And let us know the time and place you're watching from. Now, let's step into the shadows of history and explore the human story behind the wall that split the world, and the night it finally fell. In the final days of the Second World War, as the guns fell silent across Europe and the ruins of cities still smoldered, a new tension began to form in the ashes of Nazi Germany, one that would soon crystallize into a global struggle between former allies. And at the very heart of that emerging conflict stood the city of Berlin, battered, broken, and soon to be divided in ways that no one could have imagined just a few years earlier. When Adolf Hitler's regime collapsed in 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. The victorious powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, agreed that the countries should be disarmed, demilitarized, and temporarily administered by their combined authority. What began as a joint occupation, however, soon turned into a contest of ideologies. At the center of that contest stood Berlin, the former Nazi capital, now occupied by all 4 powers but situated entirely within the Soviet-controlled zone of Eastern Germany. At first, this division was more administrative than physical. The city was carved into 4 sectors, each governed independently by one of the Allies. The Soviet sector covered the eastern half of Berlin, while the western half was split between the Americans, British, and French. Though the arrangement was intended to be temporary, tensions between the Soviets and their western allies began to rise almost immediately. The Americans and British, determined to rebuild Germany as a democratic and capitalist bulwark against the spread of communism, began introducing reforms in their zones, promoting free elections, private enterprise, and economic recovery through programs like the Marshall Plan. The Soviets, on the other hand, saw these actions as a threat to their influence. They responded by consolidating their hold over East Germany, installing a pro-Moscow regime, and suppressing dissent. By 1948, the rift was undeniable. In a dramatic move, the Soviet Union attempted to force the Western Allies out of Berlin by cutting off all rail, road, and canal access to the western sectors of the city, an act known as the Berlin Blockade. In response, the United States and its allies launched the Berlin Airlift, a massive logistical effort that flew in food, coal, and medical supplies around the clock for nearly a year. At its peak, planes were landing in West Berlin every 30 seconds. It was a triumph of will, technology, and coordination, and a clear message that the West would not abandon the city. The blockade failed. In May 1949, the Soviets lifted it. But the damage was done. Cooperation had turned into confrontation. That same year, the Western Allies merged their zones into a new nation, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, while the Soviets established the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, in their zone. 2 Germanys now existed, and Berlin, though deep inside East German territory, remained a divided city, a Cold War island in a hostile sea. Over the next decade, the contrast between the 2 Berlins grew starker. In the West, reconstruction, democracy, and prosperity took root. In the East, surveillance, censorship, and economic stagnation bred resentment. The border between East and West Germany became increasingly fortified, but Berlin remained porous, a gateway through which hundreds of thousands of East Germans fled to the West, seeking freedom and opportunity. The communist regime in East Germany, backed by Moscow, grew desperate to stop the exodus. And so, in the dark hours of a summer night in 1961, trucks rolled through the streets of East Berlin, and soldiers began to unroll coils of barbed wire. The city was about to be cut in half, not just by politics or barbed wire, but by concrete and fear. In the early morning hours of August 13, 1961, while most Berliners were still sleeping, a quiet but seismic event began to unfold under cover of darkness. East German soldiers, engineers, and police, acting under direct orders from the German Democratic Republic, GDR, and with the full support of the Soviet Union, moved swiftly through the streets of East Berlin. They carried coils of barbed wire, wooden posts, concrete blocks, and weapons. Their mission was clear and urgent: to seal off all roads, railways, and pedestrian crossings into West Berlin. By sunrise, the first strands of wire stretched across streets that had just the day before allowed free movement. Train services were interrupted. Streets that had connected neighborhoods and families were suddenly impassable. People woke to find their city changed, not through debate or diplomacy, but by force. The so-called anti-fascist protective rampart, as the East German government called it, was being erected. But everyone on both sides of the divide understood what it really was: a wall to keep East Germans in. The reasons behind the drastic move were rooted in fear. Since the end of World War II, an estimated 3.5 million people had fled East Germany, many of them through the relatively open border in Berlin. These were not only political dissidents, but also young professionals, skilled workers, doctors, engineers, and students, the very people the GDR could least afford to lose. The growing exodus undermined the regime's legitimacy and weakened its already fragile economy. The Soviet leadership, under Nikita Khrushchev, warned that unless the flow of refugees was stopped, East Germany could collapse entirely. Despite the boldness of the move, the East German government sought to portray the wall's construction as a defensive necessity, claiming that it protected citizens from capitalist provocation and invasion. In truth, it was a desperate measure to prevent further defection and preserve control. In the West, the reaction was immediate and emotional. Residents of West Berlin gathered at the barricades in disbelief, many watching in tears as friends and relatives on the other side were cut off without warning. Telephone lines went dead. Trams and trains that once carried people to work and school stopped mid-route. Entire families were split overnight, husbands from wives, parents from children, siblings from one another. Some were trapped in the wrong part of the city with no chance to return. The Western Allies, particularly the United States under President John F. Kennedy, expressed outrage but acted cautiously. While West Berlin remained under Western protection, it lay deep inside East German territory, and any attempt to dismantle the wall by force risked escalating into direct military conflict with the Soviet Union. Kennedy, though privately furious, understood the geopolitical stakes. He declared that a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war, signaling that while the US would protect West Berlin, it would not intervene militarily to tear down the barrier. The first version of the wall was crude, little more than barbed wire and guards, but it was effective. People who tried to cross were stopped. Some were arrested. A few, driven by desperation, attempted to run through or climb over the wire, only to be shot or detained. In the weeks that followed, the wall was reinforced with concrete, watchtowers, and a growing presence of border guards under orders to use deadly force. Berlin, once a symbol of post-war cooperation, had now become a physical manifestation of the Cold War, a scar dividing East and West, democracy and dictatorship, freedom and fear. The once lively thoroughfares now ended in blank walls. Streets that had echoed with footsteps were silenced by tension. And for the people of Berlin, a new era had begun, one in which crossing the street could mean death, and a city once whole would remain painfully split for decades. In the months that followed the sudden closure of the Berlin border, the hastily constructed barricade of barbed wire gave way to something far more permanent and ominous. The East German government, under the leadership of Walter Obrecht, moved swiftly to transform the provisional blockade into a fortified and militarized frontier that would eventually become one of the most notorious symbols of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall. Brick by brick, the barrier took shape. What began as coils of razor wire across intersections soon evolved into a complex and carefully engineered system of fortifications. Concrete panels were erected in long rows, forming an unbroken wall that snaked through the heart of the city for more than 150 kilometers, dividing not only Berlin but also the lives and futures of millions of people. The wall was not simply a line, it became a vast, multilayered death strip. On the eastern side, behind the initial concrete wall, a no-man's land was established, cleared of buildings and vegetation to ensure maximum visibility for guards. It was filled with floodlights, anti-vehicle trenches, dog runs, and automatic firing devices. Observation towers with machine-gun-armed soldiers were positioned at regular intervals, and sand traps were laid to detect footprints. The orders given to the border guards were chillingly simple: shoot to kill anyone attempting to flee. The walls sliced through neighborhoods, streets, and even buildings. Apartment complexes that once had balconies overlooking West Berlin were bricked up overnight. Cemeteries were divided, and families were forced to attend funerals from opposite sides. Churches found themselves cut off from their congregations, and train lines were severed mid-track. For many, the absurdity of the division was only surpassed by its cruelty. Daily life in Berlin adjusted to the new reality. On the western side, people began to decorate the wall with graffiti, protests, and murals, turning it into a canvas of frustration, satire, and hope. Children played in its shadow. Tourists gathered to gaze at it. Yet for those in the east, it represented something much darker: the inescapable reach of state power. The wall was not just concrete, it was a psychological prison, a constant reminder that escape was now almost impossible. Despite the dangers, some still tried. From the very beginning, East Berliners devised bold and often desperate methods to cross to the west. Tunnels were dug beneath the wall, dark, narrow passages dug in secret, sometimes over the course of months, leading to basements or back streets on the other side. Others hid in car trunks, forged documents, or swam across canals. Some even built hot air balloons or zip lines. Each successful escape was a tiny victory, a beacon of hope, but many attempts ended in death. One of the most tragic cases was that of Peter Fechter, an 18-year-old bricklayer who, in August 1962, attempted to cross the wall near Checkpoint Charlie. Shot by East German guards, he fell back into the death strip and lay there for nearly an hour, crying out for help while neither side dared to intervene. He bled to death in full view of onlookers. His death would become a haunting symbol of the brutality of the regime. Internationally, the wall drew condemnation, but it also became a strategic stalemate. The United States, under President Kennedy, maintained its commitment to defend West Berlin but avoided direct confrontation. The Soviet Union defended the wall as a necessary act of sovereignty. The city had become a flashpoint, but one both sides feared to ignite. The wall stood not merely as a barrier of stone, but as a monument to division, of nations, of families, of ideologies. And while it kept people in, it could never fully suppress the desire for freedom that still lived behind its shadow. As the 1960s unfolded, the Berlin Wall became an accepted, though never accepted gladly, part of daily life for the city's residents. It loomed over Berlin not just as a physical structure, but as a psychological weight. For those in West Berlin, it was a grotesque monument to tyranny, a scar that marred their city. For those in East Berlin, it was a constant reminder of surveillance, suspicion, and confinement, of a government so afraid of losing its people that it had turned the city into a cage. Inside East Germany, the government of Walter Ulbricht worked tirelessly to legitimize the wall and maintain control. The Stasi, the East German secret police, expanded rapidly. Their goal was absolute surveillance, not only tracking potential defectors, but also monitoring dissenters, skeptics, artists, professors, and even loyal party members who showed signs of deviation. Neighbors reported on neighbors, teachers on students, children on parents. The wall may have blocked physical escape, but the Stasi worked to imprison thought itself. Despite this atmosphere of fear, life in East Berlin did not grind to a halt. On the contrary, the state promoted a rigid but structured vision of socialist normality. Schools, hospitals, and housing were provided, jobs were guaranteed, and life for many was modest but predictable. But beneath this veneer of order, shortages of consumer goods, censorship, and a sense of cultural isolation created deep undercurrents of discontent, though often spoken about only in whispers. In West Berlin, life evolved in a very different direction. Though it was an isolated enclave deep within communist territory, it became a showcase of Western capitalism and democratic resilience. With the support of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the United States, the city blossomed into a center of art, music, and intellectual life. It became a magnet for students, dissidents, and free thinkers. Yet it was also on the front lines of Cold War tension, and its freedom was never taken for granted. The contrasting rhythms of East and West Berlin were most vividly on display during family visits, when they were allowed. Occasionally, the East German regime permitted West Berliners to enter the East for holidays or special occasions, usually under strict monitoring. These visits were often emotional. Mothers embraced grown children, grandchildren met grandparents for the first time, and goodbyes were said with the knowledge that another visit might be years, or never, away. Meanwhile, escapes continued. Some were simple in concept, though not in risk, leaping from windows of buildings near the border in the early days, hiding in modified cars, cutting through fences at night. Others were elaborate, long tunnels dug beneath foundations, homemade aircraft, even impersonations of Soviet soldiers. Each successful escape sparked hope and embarrassment. The East German government went to great lengths to prevent them, improving the wall, expanding the death strip, rewarding informants, and punishing families of those who tried. Not all escapes ended in success. Many were caught, imprisoned, tortured, or worse. Some were shot in cold blood. The number of confirmed deaths at the wall would eventually reach over 140, though the true toll, including those killed in custody or indirectly through psychological pressure, is likely higher. Still, the desire for freedom remained irrepressible. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Cold War showed no signs of thawing. The Vietnam War, the arms race, and the tightening grip of authoritarian regimes globally gave the world little hope for an imminent change in Berlin. The wall, it seemed, was permanent, a new reality that generations would grow up with, taught to accept as immovable as geography itself. But history, as Berlin would eventually prove, is never truly fixed. Even the thickest walls cannot hold forever when the people behind them continue to dream of the world beyond. As the 1970s progressed, the Berlin Wall stood firm, gray, silent, and impenetrable. But beyond its concrete surface, the global chessboard of Cold War politics began to shift. The superpowers remained locked in ideological conflict, yet diplomacy, détente, and subtle recalibrations of strategy began to shape a new phase of the long standoff. Berlin remained the most visible symbol of the divide, but it also became a stage where delicate balances were constantly tested. The United States, under President Richard Nixon, began pursuing a new policy of engagement with the Soviet Union and China. Known as détente, this approach aimed to ease tensions through treaties, trade, and cultural exchanges. In 1972, Nixon visited Moscow, and agreements were signed on nuclear arms control, including the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT-I. These moves signaled a shift, not toward friendship, but toward cautious coexistence. Still, the wall, looming in the heart of Berlin, served as a chilling reminder that this peace was cold and brittle. For West Germany, led by Chancellor Willy Brandt, the 1970s also brought a significant change in strategy. Brandt launched Ostpolitik, a bold initiative that sought to normalize relations with East Germany and the Eastern Bloc. Rather than ignore or confront the communist regimes, Brandt sought dialogue. His government recognized the East German state diplomatically, opened trade agreements, and created new channels for communication and travel between East and West. This policy bore fruit. Limited cross-border visits became more common, particularly for elderly East Germans who were allowed to see family in the West. Cultural and humanitarian exchanges, though heavily monitored and restricted, provided a rare glimpse across the Iron Curtain. These openings did not tear down the wall, but they softened its emotional brutality for some. Brandt's efforts earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1971. And many saw Ostpolitik as a glimmer of hope that peaceful change might one day be possible. But even as diplomacy gained ground, the internal pressures within East Germany grew. The economy, propped up by Soviet subsidies and domestic surveillance, lagged far behind that of the West. Basic goods were often in short supply. Consumer choice was minimal. The drab monotony of daily life contrasted sharply with the colorful, advertisement-filled images beamed in from Western television and radio, signals that could still be picked up in many East German homes. Young people, in particular, began to feel the strain. For them, the wall was not a wartime necessity or a political bulwark. It was a wall that stood between aspiration and opportunity. The more they learned about life in the West, the more aware they became of what they lacked. Education was tightly controlled, dissent stifled, and careers limited by loyalty to the ruling party, the Socialist Unity Party, SED. Within East Germany, the Stasi remained ever watchful, expanding its network of informants to maintain a grip on the population. But the cost of such control was deepening alienation. The regime tried to project strength, yet its legitimacy relied on the narrative of external threat, a narrative that grew increasingly hollow with each passing year of comparative stagnation. Meanwhile, on the other side of the wall, West Berlin continued to thrive. It became a cultural and intellectual hub, a sanctuary for draft dodgers, artists, and radicals. Its universities attracted minds from across the world, its nightlife pulsed with energy, and its architecture reflected both history and rebirth. Yet despite its success, the city was never truly at ease. Surrounded by hostile territory, it relied on a precarious web of guarantees and logistics to survive. It was a gleaming island afloat in a gray sea. Though guns remained silent and treaties were signed, the division remained. And for Berliners on both sides, the wall was not history. It was daily life, permanent and present. But history, ever patient, continued to move. As the 1980s dawned, the Berlin Wall remained unbroken, a stone-faced sentinel of a divided world. It had stood now for nearly 2 decades, a generation. Children born after its construction were becoming adults, having never known a united Berlin. And yet, behind its cold concrete facade, subtle tremors had begun to stir. The world was changing. The Cold War, once a frozen standoff, was starting to shift. The cracks, political, economic, and human, were spreading through the foundation of the Eastern Bloc. In East Germany, the problems had grown harder to ignore. The country's planned economy, while stable by appearances, was hollowed out by inefficiency, outdated technology, and debt. Factories produced inferior goods, agricultural collectives struggled, and innovation was stifled under layers of bureaucracy. The government of Erich Honecker, who had ruled since 1971, continued to claim strength and unity, but behind closed doors, ministers and economists saw the truth. The system was failing to deliver even the basic promises of socialism. Life in East Berlin reflected this stagnation. Though jobs, housing, and education were technically guaranteed, choices were few and quality was poor. A car might take 15 years to acquire. Supermarket shelves were often half empty. Consumer goods lagged decades behind the West. Culture was tightly controlled. Western books were banned, and East German television served more as propaganda than entertainment. And yet, across the wall, the West shimmered, visible on television signals and through whispered stories from visitors who had come and gone. That contrast was growing harder to explain, especially to young East Germans who asked why a system claiming to be more just and equitable needed fences, guns, and watchtowers to keep its people inside. Internationally, change was accelerating. In 1979, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, triggering a renewed round of Cold War tensions. The United States, under President Ronald Reagan, responded by ramping up military spending and adopting a hardline stance. In 1983, Reagan famously declared the Soviet Union an evil empire and launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, a missile shield that pushed the arms race into space. Many feared confrontation, but others began to see the beginning of the end. Then, in 1985, the unexpected happened. A young and reform-minded leader named Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in Moscow. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev recognized the stagnation of the Soviet economy and the political rot within the Communist Party. He launched 2 bold initiatives: Perestroika, aimed at restructuring the economy, and Glasnost, a policy of greater openness and transparency. Though intended to strengthen socialism, these reforms unleashed forces far beyond the Kremlin's control. The changes in Moscow sent ripples across the Eastern Bloc. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, led by Lech Walesa, grew in power and influence. In Hungary and Czechoslovakia, reformers gained momentum. Even in East Germany, intellectuals, pastors, and students began to meet quietly, to publish underground leaflets, to speak more openly in church basements and small art circles. But Erich Honecker and the East German leadership refused to change course. They clung to old slogans, denounced Gorbachev's reforms, and tightened repression. Travel remained restricted, protests were suppressed, and the wall remained heavily fortified. Honecker famously declared that, "The wall will stand in 50 and even 100 years." It was a statement of defiance and desperation. Still, the mood was shifting. In Leipzig, Dresden, and East Berlin, citizens began organizing peaceful gatherings and prayer meetings. The people had not forgotten the risks, the arrests, the surveillance, the prison terms, but their patience was running out. The example of other Eastern Bloc nations gave them courage. And in the West, leaders began to speak louder, more clearly, demanding change. The wall had not moved, not even an inch. But for the first time in years, it no longer felt invincible. And across both Berlins, people began to whisper what had long been unthinkable. What if the wall could fall? By 1987, the political landscape in Europe was shifting beneath the feet of even the most deeply entrenched regimes. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union continued to open space for discussion, resistance, and political experimentation across the Eastern Bloc. Though Gorbachev made it clear that each Warsaw Pact country would chart its own course, the effect of Glasnost and Perestroika rippled outward, challenging decades of rigid authoritarianism. In East Germany, however, the government refused to follow suit. Erich Honecker, now visibly aging and out of touch, dismissed reform as a Western trap and doubled down on repression. The ruling Socialist Unity Party controlled all media and continued its surveillance of citizens through the Stasi, whose files had grown to include millions of names, photos, and conversations. The East German regime presented itself as stable and prosperous, but beneath the surface, dissatisfaction was growing, quiet, patient, and waiting for a spark. That spark came, in part, from outside. In June 1987, President Ronald Reagan traveled to West Berlin and delivered one of the most iconic speeches of the Cold War. Standing near the Brandenburg Gate, just steps from the wall, Reagan issued a direct challenge to the Soviet leader. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall!" The speech echoed across the world and inspired many. But in East Berlin, it was officially ignored, filtered out by censors and never mentioned in the press. Still, people heard. People talked. And the idea of change, of possibility, continued to spread. Meanwhile, other Eastern Bloc nations were beginning to push openly for reform. In Hungary, a new generation of Communist Party leaders began dismantling old restrictions. By 1989, Hungary had removed its border fences with Austria, creating a breach in the Iron Curtain. Thousands of East Germans, vacationing in Hungary or nearby Czechoslovakia, realized they could now escape to the west through these more porous routes. Within weeks, a growing exodus of East German citizens was pouring across the Hungarian-Austrian border, then making their way to West Germany. The East German leadership was stunned and humiliated. Their claim of control, their narrative of national unity, was unraveling before their eyes. But rather than open their own borders, they tried to crack down harder, closing the route through Czechoslovakia and pressuring Hungary to stop the flow. It didn't work. Thousands more fled. Embassies of West Germany in Prague and Warsaw became overrun with East German citizens seeking asylum, camping in courtyards, demanding visas. Inside East Germany, the pressure was mounting. Peaceful protest movements, long simmering beneath the surface, began to grow. In Leipzig, weekly Monday demonstrations started with small groups gathering at St. Nicholas Church, praying for peace and reform. At first, they were ignored. Then the crowd swelled. Hundreds turned to thousands. By the fall of 1989, they numbered in the tens of thousands, and spread to other cities. The world watched. Would the East German regime respond with violence, as China had done months earlier in Tiananmen Square? Would the tanks roll into the streets once again? But the police hesitated. The army did not move. And the people kept marching, silently, peacefully, with candles in their hands and courage in their hearts. By October 1989, Honecker's position was no longer sustainable. Even party officials had begun to turn against him. On October 18th, he was forced to resign. His replacement, Egon Krenz, promised reform, but offered only vague gestures and insincere apologies. The people were no longer willing to settle for promises. They wanted action. They wanted freedom. The wall still stood. But its guardians were unsure. Its symbolism was cracking. Its power was fading. And just weeks later, with hardly a shot fired or speech made, a mistake would open the gates, and history would surge forward. On the evening of November 9, 1989, Berlin was cold and gray, as it often was in late autumn. Life on both sides of the wall carried on with a strange familiarity. In East Berlin, the tight choreography of daily restrictions and quiet resistance. In West Berlin, the ever-present curiosity about the other half of the city, so close yet unreachable. But that night would not pass quietly. What began as a misstatement at a press conference would, within hours, become one of the most astonishing and symbolic collapses in modern history. The East German regime, reeling from mass protests, increasing defections, and mounting international pressure, had been desperately trying to control the narrative. On that Thursday afternoon, a relatively obscure Politburo member named Gunter Schabowski held a press briefing. Flustered and reading from a note he had only briefly glanced at, he announced a new policy. East German citizens would be allowed to cross the border into West Berlin and West Germany freely. A reporter immediately asked, "When does it take effect?" Schabowski paused, glanced at his notes, and then answered uncertainly, "As far as I know, effective immediately, without delay." That single sentence, broadcast live on both East and West German television, lit a fuse. Within minutes, thousands of East Berliners began to gather at the wall's checkpoints. Families, students, workers, pensioners, they came on foot, by bicycle, by tram, demanding to be let through. The border guards, unprepared and unsure, were overwhelmed. They had received no clear orders. Their weapons were loaded, but there was no appetite for bloodshed. The crowd swelled. Chants grew louder. Pressure mounted. The soldiers radioed their commanders, but no one gave firm instructions. At Bornholmer Strasse, one of the main crossings, the guards finally broke. Around 10:30 p.m., they raised the barrier. People surged forward, crossing into West Berlin, cautiously at first, then joyfully. In disbelief, West Berliners welcomed them with flowers, drinks, and open arms. Some wept. Others laughed. Strangers embraced. East Germans stood under neon lights for the first time, wandered into shops, stood silently in front of supermarkets bursting with goods. It was more than a political event, it was a human moment, raw and unscripted. Soon, the wall itself became the focus. Crowds gathered on both sides, climbing onto it, dancing, waving flags, playing music. Hammers and chisels appeared, the first Mauerspecht, or wall peckers, chipping away at the concrete that had kept a city, and a people, apart for 28 years. That night, the wall did not fall because of war, invasion, or treaty, it fell because people stopped believing in it. And when belief failed, the structure crumbled with it. The images that emerged were unforgettable. People chipping away at the barrier by hand. Soldiers watching in stunned silence. Families reunited. Children perched atop the wall, unaware they were witnessing history. News broadcasters struggled to keep up. Around the world, audiences sat in stunned awe, watching the impossible unfold. A wall built to divide had been breached by unity. In East Germany, the regime was finished. Within weeks, mass resignations, rapid reforms, and the collapse of the Communist Party's power followed. In West Germany, Chancellor Helmut Kohl began preparing for reunification. And in the East, A people long denied the right to move freely were now flowing across the border, not as refugees, but as equals. What had been meant to last for a century had not endured even 3 decades. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not just the end of a barrier, it was the end of an era. The Cold War had begun in Berlin, and now, here too, it began to end, not with gunfire, but with applause, music, and tears. In the days and weeks that followed November 9, 1989, Germany experienced a transformation so rapid, so profound, that it seemed as though the impossible had been waiting patiently just beneath the surface, needing only a crack to pour through. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not simply the removal of a barrier. It was the release of a people, of long-suppressed desires and dreams, and it triggered a flood of emotion, movement, and momentum that could not be reversed. Almost immediately, hundreds of thousands of East Germans poured into the West, not in flight, but in joy, awe, and disbelief. They visited relatives they hadn't seen in decades, walked through city streets once forbidden to them, and stood speechless in front of store windows overflowing with goods and colors they had only known through whispered stories or fuzzy television images. West Berliners welcomed them with open arms, handing out money, chocolate, flowers, and in many cases, simply smiles. The emotion was overwhelming, laughter and tears, all in the same breath. Yet while the atmosphere was jubilant, the practical challenges ahead were staggering. The governments of East and West Germany were now facing a rapidly closing window. The communist regime in East Germany had lost all legitimacy. Within weeks of the wall's fall, the ruling Socialist Unity Party collapsed. A transitional government was formed. Free elections were promised. And in March 1990, the first truly democratic elections in East Germany's history brought a sweeping victory to parties advocating rapid reunification with the West. In West Germany, Chancellor Helmut Kohl moved quickly. He saw the window of opportunity and pushed for unity. But unification was not a simple matter of tearing down a wall and redrawing borders. It involved merging two vastly different economic systems, legal codes, bureaucracies, currencies, and even mentalities. Kohl proposed a step-by-step plan that would eventually result in full political and economic unification, a bold and risky strategy, but one that resonated deeply with a population long separated by force. Internationally, the path to unity was delicate. The Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, still held formal rights over Berlin and post-war Germany. There were fears about how a unified Germany might alter the balance of power in Europe. Would the ghosts of history be stirred once again? Would the Soviet Union resist? Yet diplomacy prevailed. Through what became known as the 2+4 talks, involving East and West Germany plus the 4 Allied nations, a comprehensive agreement was negotiated. In return for assurances about borders, military limitations, and Germany's commitment to NATO and the European community, the Soviets, under Mikhail Gorbachev, agreed not to block reunification. On July 1, 1990, the West German Deutsche Mark was adopted as the official currency in East Germany, effectively binding the two economies. The physical wall was being dismantled piece by piece, but the symbolic wall, of fear, ideology, and identity, was also beginning to fade. Finally, on October 3, 1990, less than a year after the wall had fallen, Germany was officially reunited. The German Democratic Republic ceased to exist, and the 5 eastern states were incorporated into the Federal Republic of Germany. The flag that flew over the Reichstag in Berlin was no longer a symbol of division, but of unity. For the first time since 1945, Germany stood whole. But unity, though achieved on paper and in ceremony, was just the beginning. Beneath the celebrations, a more complex process loomed, one of rebuilding, reconciling, and learning to live not only as one country, but as one people. Reunification came swiftly, but its aftermath would unfold over years, even decades. The formal ceremonies of October 3, 1990, marked a historical milestone, the moment when Germany became one nation again. Flags waved, anthems were sung, and politicians declared the end of division. Yet beneath the jubilation, the real work of healing, integration, and understanding had only just begun. For many East Germans, or Aussies, as they came to be called, reunification brought with it a dizzying blend of opportunity and dislocation. The arrival of Western democracy and capitalism was not only a liberation, but a cultural shock. Their institutions were dismantled overnight. Their currency was replaced. Their workplaces were privatized or shuttered. State-owned factories closed en masse, leaving millions unemployed. The security of lifelong employment and state guarantees gave way to uncertainty, joblessness, and competition in a world many had never prepared for. For West Germans, Wessis, reunification meant both pride and responsibility. They shouldered the enormous financial cost of rebuilding the East, modernizing infrastructure, investing in housing, roads, schools, and hospitals. But frustration soon surfaced. Some in the West felt burdened, taxed to support what they saw as an outdated system. Some in the East felt patronized, their experiences dismissed, or their identities erased. Integration proved to be more than economic. It was psychological, generational, and emotional. Still, amid all the difficulty, reunification brought transformation. The Bundestag, Germany's parliament, returned to Berlin. Checkpoint Charlie, once a nerve-wracking passage between worlds, became a tourist attraction. The Brandenburg Gate, once sealed off by tanks and walls, became a symbol of European unity. Cities like Leipzig, Dresden, and East Berlin slowly regained vitality. Younger generations, unburdened by the past, began to rebuild neighborhoods, open businesses, and form new cultural identities that blended histories from both sides. The fall of the Berlin Wall also reverberated far beyond Germany. It marked the symbolic end of the Cold War, inspiring uprisings and democratic transitions across Eastern Europe. Within months of the wall's collapse, communist regimes fell in Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Albania. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself disintegrated, bringing to an end a global order that had shaped the second half of the 20th century. But memory endures. Each year, Germany marks November 9th not only as the date the wall fell, but as a day of remembrance, for the divisions it created, the lives it disrupted, and the many who died trying to cross it. Memorials now stand where watchtowers once loomed. Sections of the wall, preserved in cities around the world, serve as silent reminders of what can happen when fear triumphs over freedom. Berlin, once the city of tanks and barbed wire, has transformed into a vibrant capital of art, music, and progressive politics. A place where street murals speak of resistance, and where cobblestones still trace the wall's path through neighborhoods that have since rejoined. Tourists walk the East Side Gallery, a mile-long stretch of painted wall covered with messages of hope, protest, and memory. Yet perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Berlin Wall is not about geopolitics or ideology, but about the resilience of ordinary people. Those who endured the division, those who resisted the regime, those who risked everything for a chance to live freely. They did not tear the wall down with tanks or treaties. They dismantled it with persistence, with protest, with courage, and with the belief that no wall, no matter how thick, can stand forever against the will of the people. The wall is gone, but its story remains, not just in books and museums, but in the everyday lives of those who still walk the streets it once divided, and who now live, work, and dream on common ground.